Okay, so we'll get started. Today we have a very exciting speaker, Vilas Dhar. He is the president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And this is a foundation that bridges technological innovation and social impact with a commitment to justice and equity. So he has a very impressive background. He is an entrepreneur, a technologist, and a human rights advocate. And I think you'll see some elements of all of these in his talk today. He founded and led 2 social impact organizations before joining the McGovern Foundation. He was also the Gleitzman Fellow on Social Change at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a practitioner resident on AI at the Rockefeller Foundation at the Bellagio Center in Italy. He has many speaking engagements, many publications, and he remains very committed to civic service. He sits on many committees and boards. He's an advisor to MIT Solve, which is something you might have heard of before. He started with a bachelor's degree in both biomedical engineering and also computer science from the University of Illinois. He went on to get a master's degree in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and he got his law degree from NYU School of Law. So today he's going to talk about AI. His title is From Video Games to Artificial Intelligence, Using Tech for Good. And this is going to be a fantastic seminar. And please type your questions into the chat. And Vilas, thank you so much for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
Jennifer, thanks so much. To all of you watching today, it's such a delight to be with you. That was a really complex intro. And while I so appreciate it, I wanted to start from a different place. When I was a high school student, I had this incredible privilege, which is I grew up just a few blocks away from the National Center for Supercomputing in Champaign, Illinois. Back then, it was one of 5 centers around the country that really had been set up to bring the greatest technology in supercomputing to solve a lot of really significant scientific challenges. But as a 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, I got to be around some of the coolest computing tech that existed in the world. And it was a time when I could even walk in and peer through the window and see the Cray supercomputers, which looked like something out of a sci-fi movie compared to what we have today. I got to do this and I really got to understand how cool tech was when you had access to it and you got to use it. But I was also part of an immigrant family living in rural Illinois. And in my summers, I got to go back and spend a lot of time with my family back in India. And particularly in South India, in a place where reality every day was a lot different from what I was used to. Instead of having access to a computer and a TV and all of the devices that we had, I was in places often where we were with family and we didn't have plumbing in the house, or electricity would go out for a few hours a day. In those experiences, I had this incredible set of interactions with my grandfather. And my grandfather was one of these kind of characters from mythology. He stood really tall. He had a big bushy mustache. He was always smiling and always curious about the world. But my grandfather had a formal education that ended at 3rd grade. It's just the way and the environment in which he grew up in. And so every time I'd get a new piece of tech, a new toy, a new something that I wanted to show off, I'd proudly put it in my backpack and I'd get on the plane once every couple of summers. I'd go back to India. And it was the coolest thing I could think of to show my grandfather this new piece of technology that I had. And every single time he was so curious. He wanted to know everything about how it worked. So when I got my first cell phone, he had never seen anything like it. All he was used to was the telephone on the corner that the entire neighborhood shared. And I'd say, how does it work? And I tried to explain it to him. And in explaining it to him, I learned a lot about how tech worked. But eventually, my grandfather's curiosity about how it worked would end. And then he'd ask the same question every single time. This is really cool, but how does it help the people around me? How does it help the family next door? How does it help the farmer in the field? My grandfather cared so deeply about his community that as much as he was excited about what tech could achieve, the first thing he wanted to know was, how does it make people's lives better? How does it make their lives easier? I've held on to that my whole life. And I wanted to share that story with you because for all of you, as you enter a life's journey of being around tech, as you become experts in AI and machine learning, in whatever kind of tech you choose to use, I'll ask you to think about that question. How does this tech help people? How does it make people's lives easier? how does it let them achieve something great? So with that in mind, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the work that we do as a foundation in making sure that all of the amazing innovation we have around machine learning and artificial intelligence, around the applications that are powering everything from autonomous cars to robots to machine learning models that change the way we think about climate, how we're making sure that they're built for and by the people around the world that are vulnerable to those kinds of topics. I have a few slides and I'll walk through them. And I wish we could all be in a room together and really have a conversation. But in this case, please feel free to drop stuff into the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it. And I know some of the team here is as well. And we'll jump right in. And I just want to acknowledge before we do just what an incredible opportunity the BeaverWorks Summer Institute is. I think back to my childhood of trying to figure this stuff out on my own and how cool it would have been to have a group of people that were united in common interest and cause. And so as you all come to the end of your summer session, I hope you'll keep the friendships and relationships that you've hopefully made over the summer and carry them forward as well. So thanks so much for being with me, and maybe we'll jump into some slides. The talk we'll do today is we'll just talk a little bit about, from video games to artificial intelligence, the broad array of ways that we're bringing tech to create a better world for all of us. You know, I think you've heard a lot of this. This is my background and bio, and we don't need to spend too much time on it. Let me just share that I'm somebody who really believes in the positive power of technology. That if we were able to take this incredible inspiration and ingenuity and creativity and build stuff for the world, we could really have an amazing and bright future. So let me go past this and tell you a little bit about what our purpose is as an institution. We're a large institution. We have $1.5 billion in public capital. And with that money and with the influence that gives us, we try to achieve ways to advance artificial intelligence and machine learning in ways that create thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all of us. Those are three really important words for us, and I want to take a moment to touch on them. What does it mean to have a thriving future? It means one where everybody has a chance to participate in the benefits of technology, whether that's through employment or because services are delivered for them in ways that help them be their best selves. Equitable, which is a really important word. It means that instead of just building for the most privileged, we're building for humanity as a whole. And we're thinking as much about those populations that I grew up in that are still trying to figure out how to enter the digital transformation as those groups that already have the hottest new phone and the best new apps. And sustainable. At the heart of our work is to say, how do we build technology that ensures an environmental positive future for all of us, where our impacts on climate, our impacts on the oceans, our impact on the air we breathe is driven by positive technological innovation instead of just being harmed by it. Excuse me, we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And you'll hear me say these words often around ingenuity and creativity, but I also want to talk about kindness and generosity. As engineers in particular, these aren't words that I grew up hearing a lot about in my education. And yet, as I've grown into the world and seen how the technologies we all create impact people, it feels so important that we keep a sense of kindness and generosity in there as well. As we talk about some of these case studies, you'll see how that's coming into the stories. I want to quickly talk about Patrick McGovern. We're the Patrick McGovern Foundation. And Patrick McGovern was a character that was almost larger than life. He had an incredible history at MIT, actually. He was a student in the class of 1959, right at the beginning of the computer revolution. And he would tell this story about how he read a book called Giant Brains or Machines That Think. And to put this in historical context, this was in an era, forget about everybody having a phone on their hip or even a computer at their desk. But when the number of computers that existed in the world were far less than 100, maybe even less than 20. At the time, people were beginning to think about what it would look like if a machine could think, could analyze, could actually generate new ideas. And he committed his life to building better public understanding of those issues. So he built a media organization that created magazines so that people all around the world could understand what the frontier of computing was. And he believed deeply in the idea that if we could do really great research on how the human brain works, then we could advance the frontiers of computing and technology. And so at MIT, there's an incredible institution called the MIT Institute for Brain Research, and of course, this foundation. That's the bio of the person, but I'll tell you that he also had an incredible love of students who are curious and passionate about technology. I think if you could see all of you working on this today, I think you'd be really happy about that as well. So let's get into it a little bit. Our vision for what a world looks like with AI and machine learning takes us from where we are today to where we might be in the future. Today, we're in a world where tech is mostly created by technologists. It's created by the big tech companies, and we all recognize their names, and by great researchers who are working inside of universities. And policymakers are stepping in to say, oh, this technology maybe creates some harms, privacy harms, or the amount of face time or screen time that we're all using. And so policymakers are coming in to regulate that, to say, how do we create more competition among tech companies or better rules for the kinds of products they can create? I don't think those are the wrong people to be doing this work. I'm an engineer myself, and I've spent a lot of time in the policy space. These people have really great ideas and a lot of commitment. I don't think they're the wrong people to be shaping our future. But I do have a strong commitment to the idea that it's not enough. We need more voices. We need to represent people who are using these technologies. We need to represent the people who are being affected by them and give them a way to shape this future together. So we think about, how do we accelerate applications of AI that help these situations, that help these people take ownership over the problems they face? How do we advocate for a term we think of as digital dignity? So to make sure that we as individuals all have a presence on the open web, on the internet at large, that we are having a voice in how technology is developed ethically. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our session today. And that we have really great stewards of our data and of our digital future. So, I'll skip through this relatively quickly, but our work focuses on 3 big columns. We do a lot of work around grant making. We support nonprofit organizations to build really cool tools, machine learning and AI as their background, but really communities as their primary focus. We work with nonprofits to build their capacity to build these tools themselves. As many of you might know, technologists, once they come out of college, often want to go to a tech company, and that's where careers often start. What if we could envision a world where technologists come out of college or graduate school and went straight to an organization that was working to alleviate poverty or was trying to build better communications network in rural areas? And in our third context, we think a lot about ethical leadership. How do we make sure that we're providing really great support for the best thinkers and leaders who are trying to advance a view of building this technology in a way that supports all of our best interests? We work all around the world, and really, I think we're seeing incredible innovation in places as far-flung as Argentina and Brazil, as Indonesia, as well as right here at home in the US. I'm not sure, but I think maybe some of our folks on the call today are calling in internationally as well. So there is really international scope to this work. So let's quickly talk about the fact that AI and data solutions are pervasive, right? We see more and more about them in the news. They're everywhere. These examples that are listed on this slide will be intimately familiar to all of us, and we don't need to go through them one by one. But everything from Face ID to travel to Spot the robot dog, all of these are using these tools in interesting ways. But what I do think happens is we hear a lot of these stories from a commercial perspective. What are the new products that are coming out to market, and what are they being built for? I want to focus our conversation today on the idea that these tools can really be used to advance social progress. The picture that's on this slide is of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you haven't heard of these before, this is a way for us to take all of the different challenges that face humanity and put them into one matrix. Some of the things on here you'll find quite logical and intuitive. How do we get humanity to a place where there's no malnutrition, that people aren't going hungry? Goal number 2. Or that we're building built environments in cities that are environmentally sustainable, that we're not creating more pollution than we're saving by having people in cities. Goal number 11. These goals are worth taking a look at even outside of this presentation. They're adopted by the United Nations and by all of the countries of the world and give us a framework to think about social progress. But they also give us an amazing framework to think about where technology can step in to advance these goals. So around things like zero hunger, we have now AI solutions that are being created that help farmers better understand when to plant and when to harvest their crops to increase food yields from land. We have AI solutions that are helping distributors understand how to take food that's grown on farms and bring them into consumers in ways that limit waste so that food isn't rotting or getting spoiled along the way. We're thinking about how you use AI to track emissions. And one of the projects that I'll talk to you about a little bit later is we're supporting actually building a satellite that from space will monitor greenhouse gas emissions all across the world. That generates so much data that there's no way people sitting in front of a monitor could ever use it to come up with actionable results. And so we're building the AI systems that will use that data to give us really good and targeted information about where we have dirty coal plants that we should be addressing, or where we have different kinds of agricultural interventions that might create great value. And I'd be remiss if we didn't talk again about this question that even as we build tools to advance these goals, we should be doing them in ethical ways. I imagine maybe some of the folks on this call, and maybe many of you have seen this movie called Coded Bias that came out on Netflix, along with A Social Dilemma. These two films talk about the discriminatory algorithms that were unintentionally deployed around facial recognition. And the fact that the way social networks are being deployed are taking us more and more away from our families, our friends, our real world experiences, and putting them on phones. So as we think about delivering on the promise of these technologies, we have to keep in mind what the rules and principles are that we want to promote to build an ethical world. So with that as framing, that AI is everywhere, that AI potentially can be used to advance social goals, and that in order to do so, we need to do so ethically. I thought we'd take a few minutes and talk about a bunch of different cases where we're seeing this is happening. As I said, I welcome any kinds of questions if people want to jump into them as we go, but maybe we'll go to the first one. So the question I'll pose to you in these case studies is to think about what kind of world could we create together if we use these tools to center human rights, to center the sustainable development goals that we just talked about, to center equity and privacy, to center sustainability. It seems like an easy question. It all fits on one slide. And yet this is the conversation that I think we as a society need to have. And we need to bring technologists right into the heart of it. So let's talk about a few examples. The first doesn't even step into the world of data and AI yet. It has to do with leveraging the power of play. One of the organizations that we're so proud to support with, called Child's Play, realized that when children have chronic medical conditions and they're sent to hospitals, often they get really great care, medical care, and their families are with them, but there are massive blocks in the day where children are just left by themselves, sometimes bedridden, sometimes with a TV, but no real way to connect or engage or be creative and enthusiastic about learning new things. And so Child's Play is an organization that realized that we could start pretty easily by doing things like putting a Nintendo Switch in a hospital room and giving a child a place to go out and explore a virtual world. That quickly grew into an organization that today supports hospitals all around the country and all around the world by putting educational technologies and gaming into children's bedrooms inside of hospitals so that children can begin to say, how do I connect with others in an online environment? How do I go out and play games that teach me? How do I connect and learn? And I love to start with this example because when we talk about leveraging tech for good, we don't have to go right to the emergent frontier of what kind of algorithms we're building or how machine learning is working with millions of data sets. The story sometimes starts from the one individual who's in a moment of vulnerability, who's feeling a little bit isolated and could use a little bit of love and attention and empathy. And technology gives us a way to leverage people and time and space to make sure that thousands of children across the country now have an educational pathway using tech that they otherwise wouldn't have had. We're now understanding from Child's Play that they're beginning to use data to understand not just how the availability of these tools helps them, but in understanding how when there's pain or anxiety or fear, different kinds of tools can help them sort of come out of that, to reset and reorient. This to me is just an amazing example of how tech can do good in a very easy intervention in a very simple way. But let's step up the level of complexity a little bit. Let's go to something a little bit more data-driven. So in this example, I want to talk a little bit about healthcare and community. Khushi Baby is an organization that works in northwestern India. We learned about them through MIT, actually, through an organization called MIT Solve that brings really great technical innovators from around the world and brings them to Cambridge to show off a little bit of the work they're doing and to gather some public support. Khushi Baby is an organization that's really focused on delivering healthcare to what we call the very last mile. So if you think about it, there are hospitals in cities, and then you take roads out of big cities and you get to smaller towns and villages that often have clinics. And then maybe you take the roads out a little bit further down to very small villages where there might be a local medical professional. But what happens then if you get out of your car and you start to maybe take a motorcycle down some dirt trails, and then eventually the motorcycle can't go any further and you walk the last mile to find communities and settlements that exist all over the world that have never had access to formal medical care. And these people struggle with the same things that we do here in the United States and all around the world, everything from maternal health to being able to understand what they do if they have high blood pressure or diabetes, to sometimes those acute things that have come into focus in the last year, like what happens when a community like this has to deal with COVID. Khushi Baby not just trains people to actually go out to those villages and provide them with healthcare, but has built a digital platform so that as these people are out interacting really in the most rural and remote parts of the world, how can they begin to gather data about what people need and what they're asking for, about long-term signifiers of their health, to begin feeding that into a data analysis platform that also adds in things like public data records around what people are talking about on social media, or around transportation electricity use patterns. Because when people get sick, what do? Sometimes the first thing they do is they send out messages on social media or on platforms like WhatsApp to others asking for help. Sometimes you see a spike in the amount of traffic that's going to these villages, and you can track it up to that last mile piece. If you had that incredible data set from not just hundreds or thousands, but from millions of people, what could you do to help governments say, this is a population that's really at risk? Instead of just positioning some medical resources, how do we do a large-scale intervention? How do we go into a community and help them think about nutrition so that they're eating in more healthy ways to fend off the long-term effects that they're facing? This work gives us a model for what we might do all around the world to bring machine learning and AI to healthcare generally. To say, by aggregating and accreting millions of records and millions of patient stories and experiences, how do we build what we call precision medicine? So that when one person presents with a health challenge, we have the accumulated knowledge of how we've treated millions of people to build a model that lets us really direct and target care. I'm super excited about this work. And we have to understand that even when we build these models, potentially here in the US or in the global north, those might cover the kinds of health challenges that we might face here, but often they don't cover the health challenges present in a low and middle income country or a remote area. And so the work that Khushi Baby is doing to flip it on its head, to say, let's start first with those rural and remote populations and use that to inform our global thinking, builds a more robust solution and a better data set. As emerging engineers, this is a lesson for all of us to think about, is when we build a solution, where are we starting from in terms of the data sets and the populations that we're addressing? And how do we make sure that the things we build are as universal as possible so they solve global problems instead of just local ones? The next example takes us to a totally different space. Instead of thinking about healthcare in a rural and remote area, let's talk about how we bring together all of the institutions and governments that came together to address COVID and give them a platform to share information and act together more effectively. So we, at the start of the pandemic, realized that the scale of what was going to happen was so big that we needed really great technical interventions. And so I'll talk about a few of the things that we supported our partners in doing. The first was, as we understood, and I'm going to take these in reverse order, I'm going to talk about COVID Act Now first. But in the first few months of the pandemic, as everybody was scrambling to understand just how serious and significant of a global challenge this was, everybody asked for the same thing. What data do we have about who's getting sick, about how this thing is getting transmitted, about how we position medical assets? And again, as a group of budding engineers, I will say this to you, and this is a real lesson to take away, is we always assume that we have great data, and we rarely question the assumptions behind it. COVID made us question almost every single assumption about the quality of data that we have access to. We thought the US government would have a really great data infrastructure that meant that if you went and saw your doctor in a hospital, eventually somebody somewhere in Washington would be able to get some information about that. It turned out it wasn't the case at all. The way that we had built data systems was if you went to a local doctor or a hospital, maybe if we were lucky, that got reported to the county. Maybe if we were really lucky, the county was reporting to the state, but we weren't lucky enough really to have all of the states reporting to the CDC in Washington. So COVID Act now stepped forward and said, we're a set of data engineers and data scientists, and we can solve this problem. And so what they did was they began to build automated mechanisms to go to all of the different disparate data sources around the country and begin to vacuum up all of that data. Along the way, to build new dynamic ways to clean that data and put it into common formats, to make sure that you are reconciling statistical anomalies, and essentially to build a single data set that could be trusted across the country to give us a view into what was happening around COVID, certainly not on a real-time basis as into the minute, but on at least a daily basis. That data was then used by everyone you could think of. It was used by state health commissioners, county health commissioners, national policymakers to begin to make some decisions around things like when we close and open schools, something that I feel like many of you probably felt very acutely. Those decisions were made by policymakers who were looking at this data set. It was an incredible example of how engineers could step forward and solve a social and a policy problem by building a set of technologies that really said, let's broaden the story and make sure that everybody's adequately and accurately represented. Now, as groups like COVID Act Now and a team at Johns Hopkins were doing this work to build these data sets, something started popping up over and over again. And it was the fact that as we looked at the populations that were affected, there was a disproportionate effect of COVID on marginalized, on vulnerable, on racial minority populations. And we began to get an inkling of this anecdotally. We heard it from doctors that were saying, in the community where I work, the incidence rate and the mortality rate is so much higher than what we're seeing at the country level. And so a group of data scientists and engineers came together in partnership with The Atlantic, which is a very large magazine. And they said, you know what, let's actually build a way to segment this data so that we can create real visibility in what the social and human story is of marginalized populations. And so the COVID tracking project at The Atlantic was born. And over the course of nearly a year, they began to put this incredible spotlight on the social inequities and the injustice of marginalized populations who were getting COVID at much higher rates than other populations. And when they got them, because they had such limited access to great healthcare, they were having much more severe and significant outcomes attached to it. Now, I wish I could tell you that the conclusion of this story is because of this work, we had a total transformation in how marginalized populations experience COVID. But the reality of our work and the reality of the work that you will do in the world is that it's never in absolutes. If anything, we've advanced that conversation a little bit, but the same injustices and inequities still exist in the world today. And if COVID's no longer the lens that's showing them, then we as engineers have to really think about where we find other data, other ways to tell the story of these people and make sure that they're getting agency and the kinds of tools they need to advocate for themselves. It takes us to kind of the next story that I want to talk about here, which is the organization called the Marshall Project. Again, and I want to make this clear, these are not organizations that are super tech savvy. They're not Facebook or Amazon or Microsoft. They don't have teams of thousands of data engineers. But they start from a problem, and they realize that to understand the problem well, they need technologists who really understand machine learning, that understand data aggregation, that understand how to find meaning in numbers and in interactions. And so the Marshall Project is a news organization that was set up to really explore the criminal justice system in America, to understand why it is that you saw such disparate outcomes for people who went through the criminal justice system at the level of, a courtroom trial, at the level of sentencing, and even in terms of recidivism, which is a word that we use to describe how people who have been convicted of a crime maybe are more or less likely to commit a crime again in their future. The Marshall Project looked at the prison system and said, nobody's really paying attention to the spread of COVID there. And so they built one of the most comprehensive databases of how COVID was spreading and affecting prison populations across the country. Prisons are notoriously not a place you go to gather really good data. They're very closed in and isolated. And so this combination of journalists and technologists had to use a number of innovative measures. They had to get in the front door. They had to talk to data systems managers. And they built a comprehensive database that was then used by Elizabeth Warren. Some of you might know her as the senator from Massachusetts, or Cory Booker, also a senator. Amy Klobuchar, a senator who brought forward prison reform legislation and supported community advocacy, and it supported an incredible amount of media attention. Again, a story here where technology provides progress. It doesn't solve the problem, it's not a panacea, but it equips people to really understand and wrestle with questions of fundamental equity and inequity in the world. A couple more quick stories taking us to a totally different landscape. One around climate conservation and the world that we're all inheriting even today. I'll give you two great little stories here where technology are really advancing our mission around building a more sustainable world. Conservation International is an incredible organization that really focuses on biodiversity, on conservation, on making sure that we have a really thriving planet. With them, we've worked on a couple of things that feel really immediate. One is Wildlife Insights. This is a program where we've gone around the world, and Conservation International has worked with organizations to place very simple cameras on wildlife trails through all kinds of forested and unforested lands. Those cameras that are super simple devices feed information back to a comprehensive data platform. And Conservation International is working to layer on top of that machine learning and pattern recognition to eventually be able to dynamically identify wildlife in every single one of their interactions with trail cameras all around the world. With that data set, we can have such an amazing view on populations that are at risk of extinction, of how animals are moving in response to human-created environmental changes, to allow for where there are mechanisms of really good and sustainable ecotourism, to let people interact with animals in ways that are not disruptive to their patterns. And to be honest, in some ways, to also protect human settlements from the encroachment of animal populations that are in times of crisis because of what we're doing to their lived environments. This is a really great example of how you can build technology that in many ways is kind of off the shelf tech. A lot of the stuff that they might be using in Wildlife Insights might be the same stuff that drives your autonomous car, that might be the same stuff that drives facial recognition, but used to solve this fundamental problem of how do we make sure that wildlife populations are conserved, protected, and are allowed to thrive. And similarly, and again, something that I said was quite timely, we're working with them to support systems that monitor fires, wildfires in massive swaths of the US now, in Canada, and really around the world, to give us better early warnings and surveillance of where these kinds of wildfires might threaten human populations, but might threaten also our lived environment. And finally, we're really focused and interested in this question of how we take all of these global satellite data sets that are monitoring our planet and create a way to use it. I don't know about you folks, but I love to go on Google Earth and just sort of skate around and go and take a look at entire contours of continents, but then zoom in on the house I grew up in as a kid to see how the things that we know in the world around us are placed on a planet that has such incredible beauty and opportunity. Well, if you're a practitioner in the climate space, sometimes you're faced with a struggle of saying, I know there's a lot of data out there, but I don't know how to turn it into a cohesive story, to put it in one kind of format or place where I can draw the insights I need to. And so things like trends.earth, which is something that you can find online and go and engage with and play with, will give you ways to identify kind of satellite assets, to ask and query different kinds of information, and to begin to pull out data that'll inform your own curiosity and your journeys, and maybe even your work. On a similar vein, with the World Resources Institute, this organization, which is a leading climate change organization, has worked to say there's so much data in the world. What if we could bring together a team of technologists to really integrate everything from the satellite data I just spoke about to the lived experiences of people who are walking down their street and saying, you know what, every time it rains really hard, this portion of our street floods. And as climate change is happening, every year it rains more and more and more and more houses get flooded. We should do something about this. So how do we pull together that kind of citizen level engagement, the stories people tell about their environment, with what we know from these highly technical tools to create a single integrated data lab? And again, if you go to the World Resources Institute website, you can actually click through and you can begin to have access to amazing and massive data sets that tell you about all kinds of phenomena happening around the world, and begin to pull together different data sets to create new stories and new analytics and new frameworks for the kind of work that you might want to do going forward. So definitely one to keep in mind and bookmark if you're so inclined. We're coming to the end of our slides here and the talk, and I want to have lots of time for questions, but I do think it's important to talk about two more examples. And these are examples that are really close to my heart. We've talked a lot about how organizations, with the help of technologists like all of you on this call, can pull together lots of data sets, can build analytics and platforms, can shine a light on understanding problems and create policy responses. But there's also all of those ways that technologists can directly go in and solve a problem itself. And so I'd like to talk about a couple of these. The first one is an organization called the International Wakashan AI Consortium. The Wakashan people constitute a set of tribes of indigenous Americans that primarily are centered around the American Northwest and Southeast Canada. These groups speak ancestral languages, and in those languages are contained all the stories of their peoples. I led this talk that we're having together with a story about my grandfather, something that's so important for me to talk about. But my grandfather and I never spoke in English. We spoke in a language called Kannada, a language that exists in the south of India. And in that language were all of the stories that he would tell me about our family going back generations. If he and I couldn't speak the same language to each other, I would have missed out on all of those stories, and I would have missed out on how it shaped me as a young person. Well, with indigenous languages in particular, a number of these languages are beginning to go extinct. The people who speak them use English as a primary language. There's fewer places to interact, and we're losing the stories and mythologies, particularly of oral traditions. And so the Wakashan AI Consortium has said, you know what? As a technical field, we really understood how to do speech recognition, of how to do translation, of polymorphic inscription, of understanding how to take languages and break them down and create meaning from them. And if any of us today went to Google Translate, we could easily type in a sentence and have it translated into probably close to 100 languages around the world. But unfortunately, nobody's really focused on that for indigenous languages, for the Wakashan languages in particular. And so Michael Runningwolf, who has had a real engagement with MIT through Solve and other plans, put together a consortium of people that said, you know what, we'll build digital assistants like Siri that work in the Wakashan languages. We'll build an ASR mechanism that translates Wakashan into English, into other languages around the world. And we'll begin to build the deep neural net model that actually takes these languages and puts them into frame, so that as we encounter new indigenous languages, we have an open, extensible model that we can use to capture all of this work. It's an example of technologists coming together and saying, here's a really defined problem that has big cultural and social implications, but we could just get together in a room and we could hack this thing out and we could deliver a code base that lets us do this work. It's an incredible example of that idea of taking ownership over a problem, but really the point of it is to give agency and ownership back to the people whose stories we're helping to promote. And the last example here that I want to talk about is something called the Earth Defenders Toolkit. We talked earlier in this conversation about how these big nonprofits and organizations are distilling and creating kind of data for everyone to use. But in this idea of thinking about often indigenous peoples, but people who have been marginalized all around the world, they don't often have access to things like, okay, well, let me spend some time on my laptop to go to this website to go and figure out how this data is used and how it maybe can be applicable to my setting. They certainly have the capacity for it, but sometimes they don't have the time or the infrastructure. So an organization called Digital Democracy has stepped out to say, let's take all of these tools and make them as accessible as possible to frontline defenders. So for the individuals who are living in a place like Peru and facing illegal deforestation on a daily basis, how do we give them a set of tools that they can use on their cell phone that gives them access to open mapping, that really lets them share information with other community actors about where this deforestation is happening, that let them have access to a digital online international platform, so as they begin to find the stories of these incredible abuses that are happening, they can share them quickly and immediately to an international and global audience. and a management tool that lets them say, I can, again, with my phone, walk and understand what I'm seeing compared to what should be on my maps through a version of augmented reality. So that I can begin to take all of this information we know about what should be happening and correlate it to what my experience is as I walk around. This product that we just launched a few weeks ago, and again, I'll encourage you to go and take a look at this if you're interested, has the ability and the potential to transform how frontline Earth defenders are working all around the world. And for those of us who are sitting at home and really interested and committed to advancing the space, gives us a place to plug in and say, you know what, I bet I could build a tool that would help these people in their work. And those can be really easy and modular activities that we can set an intention around and really build something technical. So we've talked about a lot of different case studies of where people are using these technologies. And my intent in this time is not to lecture you about what other people are doing, but hopefully to create a little bit of a sense of inspiration and curiosity. I know that you all have it already, to fan those flames a bit, to ask you to ask the question, as you go through a program like Beaverworks, as you begin to become really familiar with the tools that you have, what are you going to do with it? What's the future that you want to create? That having this incredible access to the tools that let you build anything you want in the world, what purpose will you put them to? What change do you want to see happen? And I'll ask you to consider a few questions. You know, it's something that I've spent a lot of my time, my life, reflecting on and figuring out. And I'll tell you that if you'd asked me at different points in my life, I would have had different answers, but they all align to the same kinds of questions. I was trying to figure out, and I still am today, what's my purpose in life? With all of the skills that I have, with the ability to code, to set up machine learning systems, to now work in philanthropy, why do I do what I do, and who can I help with it? These are questions that I hope you're thinking about all the time, but for me, they're framed around, you know, what are the communities and identities that I want to adopt? Who is it that I am as a person, and who are the people who are like me? Where do we find vulnerability in those populations, and how do we shore up our communities in the largest sense, the humanity around us, to be able to use tech to achieve what they want to achieve, to escape the kind of negative effects of what's happening in the world around us, and to build their own positive stories? For me, the question has always been, where are my passions, and how do I find mentors, friends, peers, a community of support to advance that work? I'll again say that maybe this program is one step in that direction for you, to find who your friends will be in your technological journey, who your peers will be, who you'll bounce ideas off of. And I'll ask you to think a lot as you come to the end of the summer and you go back to your schools and your communities on a full-time basis. Where are you spotting ways where technology could solve problems that maybe people aren't thinking about yet? It can be as small scale as, I talked about an organization called IC Change that built an app that lets you talk about where you're seeing climate effects in your neighborhood, all the way up to saying, you know, I really have understood a particular category of machine learning algorithms. I could probably build something that helps with issues of racial equity or of economic injustice, of access to resources and access to capacities. So with that, I'll end. You know, I started by telling you how much of an optimist I was. And I hope you'll see through some of the stories we've talked about today, the incredible opportunity for technology to advance our shared mission. Pat McGovern, who I talked about at the start of our conversation, always had this maxim that we've really adopted, which is the best is yet to come. A better world's possible. The question is, who's going to shape it? And I know that at least one of the answers is going to be those of you on this call today. And I can't wait to see what you build. So I'll pause there. Thanks so much for sharing this time with me. And I'm very excited to talk about any questions you might have for the next few minutes.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Vilas. So we do have a whole bunch of questions, and maybe we can start with Daria. You have a question about how to prepare yourself to take on some of these challenges. Would you like to ask him your question?
I was wondering, can you name any notable projects that the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation has either sponsored or worked on?
Sure, I'd be super happy to. I think you said notable projects, is that right? Sure. So a number of the projects we talked about today are projects that we've had the chance to sponsor and support. Just to give you a view to some of the other things we work on in our strategic grant making, we focus on digital health systems empowerment. So in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, how do we support governments in building an entire data-driven health architecture? We've talked a lot about climate on this call. And to bring it very close to home, something that we did over the last year in connection with our COVID data was we partnered with an organization called Ariadne Labs and the New York Times. And we built an op-ed that some of you might have seen that was called, "What's Your Place in the Vaccination Line?" And so we took a lot of complex data and we built a mechanism where you could go to a website and you could put in your demographics, kind of where you live and your age and some health conditions. And the data system would come back with an idea of where you sat between the first person to get the vaccine and the 200 millionth, what you might expect. Now, that seems like a pretty easy kind of answer, right? But what that really helped with was letting people get comfort around the idea that there was a place that they had. It wasn't just an unknown. It wasn't going to be random. It also drove a real understanding and policy about how we would allocate the COVID vaccine to lots of folks. So just one more example there.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, Ariane, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So thank you for the talk. I think it was like a really interesting talk, and it gave me like a new perspective on like a lot of like the uses of technology for social good. And so my question was, as high schoolers, what would you recommend that we do, or like what opportunities do you recommend that we take to sort of pursue these opportunities and try to like contribute to these problems in our own way? Like, so an example would be like joining an organization or something like that, et cetera, et cetera.
That's an awesome question, Ariane. Thanks so much. I have a really strong point of view on this because much like all of you, as a high school student, I was really eager to get into the mix. So I think I have 3 ideas for you. The first is you have to build technical competence and skills, right? And that's what you're all so invested in doing over the summer, over the next couple of years, really learning how to use these tools in effective ways. But accompanying that is the idea that even as you learn how to use the tools, I'm a big fan of doing projects that began to advance like a pretty small and specific outcome. The beauty of the world we live in now is when you see a challenge in your community, to build and deploy an app, an algorithm, a solution is something that's absolutely accessible to each one of you, particularly if you're able to work in teams and groups. I have a feeling that, you know, a team of 4 or 5 of the folks on this call together could build a pretty amazing app or intervention within a summer, and probably much faster than that. So what I want each of you to recognize is you hold the power and ownership about it. We're no longer living in a world where you have to go and join a 10,000 person tech organization and be one cog in the machine in order to try to create an outcome. So the first is build technical competency. The second is start doing these kinds of projects. And the third thing that I would say is so important for those of you who aspire to be engineers is to make sure that you're also learning about the communities in the world around you through this frame of saying, where are there challenges? Where are there opportunities to do something great? And so I would tell you it's just as important to volunteer in your communities, to begin to work with social change organizations, as it is for you to become better and better technologists. And again, the kind of thing that you can do during the school year, hopefully, in a Zoom world in particular, there's all kinds of ways to engage. And I would talk to your school counselors. I would also probably talk to the team here at BeaverWorks, because I have a feeling they have lots of great ideas for you. Thanks, that's an awesome question. I want to acknowledge, Ariane, in the question you asked and so many of you have asked, you start from a place of positive intention of saying, how can I help and how can I be better? And I want to name that because when we see that in the world, all kinds of good things happen. So thanks for that.
Thank you. That was a really great answer.
Fantastic. Akshi, you have a question about adoption of technology?
Yeah, so first I want to say thank you for this talk. It was really insightful. I just had a question about how do you establish trust between like all these technological advanced systems, especially in places that haven't been exposed to them before, and how, you know, it kind of, especially in like post-colonial societies, it sort of mirrors what we, a lot of the thought process that we've seen in history. And so how do you just establish trust and help get these communities to get more help?
That's an amazing question. And one that I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about, but maybe I'll give you some really quick responses. The first one is, I think the fact that you've identified this question around trust is so important. And the way I think about trust is actually not how people trust technology. It's how we trust technology creators and technology implementers. right? The trust isn't so much between me and my app. It's between me and the people who will have access to what I do on the app, how I provide my data, how I share it. And so my short answer to you actually is, as technologists, we have to step into a social and ethical and a moral conversation and say, what are the systems of power that are defining how this technology is going to be used? And if there's an aspiration to do that, I think that could be really helpful. What's happened today is a little bit of the fact that we've kind of stepped back a little bit as a society and said, when technologists deploy a product, we'll just kind of jump in. We'll jump into the pool and we'll start using it, right? And then a group of people are coming forward and saying, but wait, there's a few things we should think about first. We need to flip that model on its head. And one of the things that I think we need is a generation of technologists who are socially minded and people who are historians and sociologists and economists and everybody else who also really understand technology, so that we can have a meaningful conversation that brings everybody together around that. You asked a question that I did very poor service to, Akshay, but this question of, particularly in a post-colonial era, how do we build systems that we trust? I'm actually going to ask all of you to think about that and to progress that work. And I'm very happy to be a partner in it. It's something we all need to do together.
Beba, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. I'm very sorry. You have a question about considering negative impacts of technology?
Yeah, so when developing a lot of these technologies, sometimes you hear about their applications outside of the field they were originally designed for. And a lot of the times those applications aren't really beneficial. So when designing technologies, how do you account for these possibly negative uses?
It's a really good question. I want to talk about it. But first, will you please introduce yourself to everyone and tell us how to say your name properly?
My name is pronounced Vapov.
Hi, Beth. Thank you so much. So it's a great question. The question is, when technologies are deployed, how do we begin to guard against different uses of them? I might flip the question on its head and say, when we deploy a technology that gets used for, we might call it an off-label use, right? How do we make sure that we are out in front of understanding how it's going to affect particularly vulnerable populations? And so there's a little bit of, we can't just wait for legislators or Congress to make rules about how we use technology. I'm a big advocate of the fact that each of us as engineers needs to play a role in an ethical mesh, where we're making decisions not just about our own actions, but that we're interacting with other engineers and other technologists on a regular basis and saying, we're willing to ask hard questions like, hey, have you thought about the fact that when you deploy that technology, it prioritizes a particular community and it deprioritizes another one? So the short answer to your question is, I think we hold that responsibility. It's not something that's often talked about, I don't think. And particularly when I was going through my engineering curriculum, we never talked about it. But the fact that we're asking the question now is a start. We all hold shared responsibility to call out ethical deviations or moral challenges in the technologies we see around us, whether we're the creator of them or not.
Okay, maybe one last question from Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam, and I wanted to just thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was really interesting, and I especially loved your insights on how you talked about how we need data to create stories so we can draw insights from that. And I just thought that was really interesting. So my question is for projects and ideas that students are passionate about, what advice would you give us when there's many unknowns that we have but really want to pursue these projects?
That's a great question. The first thing I would say is something that we hold very closely here at the foundation, and we call it a let's try it attitude. And so the first thing I will say to you is, when you have an idea or a sense that something is possible, instead of first figuring out all the reasons why it won't work, you start by saying, here's one reason why it might work. Let's go and try it. And I think particularly when you're working in groups, to be able to bring that momentum to say, we make progress through action. We learn from our mistakes and we accept our failures, but all the time we're moving and we're dynamically trying to create something, is what we all should aspire to be as engineers, right? We all, I think, got into an interest in this space because we like to build things. And I think that's the biggest thing I can share with you is, if you have an idea for a project, if you have an idea for a platform, the starting point is to say, let's go and build the MVP. Let's go build the proof of concept. Let's test it. Let's iterate it. Let's make it better. But we have to start from somewhere. So with that in mind, I'm going to leave that with all of you as a challenge, right? Is what are we going to build together? And let's go out and start trying to build it. let's start making it happen. I've so enjoyed this time with all of you. Thanks so much for listening and sharing and being in a conversation. Jennifer, back to you.
Thank you so much, Vilas. So at this time, I'd like to ask 3 students to come and formally thank you and present you with a virtual gift. So Tejas, Xenia, and Reina.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Mr. Dhar. Xenia, Reina, and I are from the remote sensing program, but I think I speak for all of us in this seminar that your presentation was very insightful and valuable for all of us as we continue our journeys in STEM. I loved that you emphasized that we should always keep kindness and generosity at the center of what we do to create a shared future, especially in today's increasingly digitized world. And I'll pass it on to Reina and Xenia.
Yeah, thank you so much for this super engaging talk on AI for social good. As somebody who's interested in going into AI, I found it really interesting how you focused on not just the technical side, but also communication and policy, which I think more engineers should realize is just as important. I really hadn't thought about that. And I'll pass it on to Xenia.
Yeah, I want to say thank you so much for giving this talk and from approaching science, not from like the perspective of we created this new technology, what can we do with it? But from, well, what do we need to do and how can we apply technology to that? I feel like it's really important to think about helping people and not just about, what's possible. And so here we have for you a virtual t-shirt.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you all so much. Really very kind of you. And I have really enjoyed this time together. I can't wait to see what you all achieve as you go out into the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vilas. Everyone, you can unmute and clap.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.